50, but 32 right now looks like pretty good participation. So this is Maj Blessinger. I think most of you, if not, one of the ADOs that works up in the front. So I'll be doing a CT today on VDP planning. So this came out of the really derived from last week off of the CT that Stoll did with the IRC hot topics. And what came out of that was we talked about CDFAs, so constant descent flight path or flight angles, and then part of that we got in and started talking about VDPs and how to calculate that. And so we decided to do a specific CT just for this. So here's a quick and dirty presentation for today, and hopefully it kind of clarifies or rehacks some of the stuff you learned from pilot training. So two main things I want to talk about today is VDPs, and then along with that is the vertical descent angle, which is what you see published on the approach plates. So to start off with here, I got a couple kind of questions. I'll see if I can throw it out to one of the lieutenants and see what you guys come up with for these, whether it's the VDP or how do we use them, and are we allowed to descend prior to VDP? Any lieutenants out there?
Yeah, it's a pledge.
Hey, what you got, Jake?
Hey, so VDP is a visual descent point. And we use VDPs to basically get us from the MDA down to the runway at a nice 3-degree glide path. And you can descend before a VDP, but you shouldn't. Well, the 217 says you shouldn't. And then you can descend afterwards as well, but basically not if you can't keep the runway in sight. And I think it says attain like a safe glide slope to the runway.
Yeah, man, you're spot on. So the whole intent of the VDP is to get us in that ideal spot on the final approach where we can then do a stabilized descent. And I'm sure all of you, even the newer people, have been tracking that. Really, the crux of how we increase our safety is being stabilized, and you'll see more efforts out there to push forth programs to give us better approaches, more stabilized approaches. And the VDP is it's pretty old, but it's one of those methods we use to give us that best put us in the best position possible to have a safe landing. And so, Jake, you're right. It's chapter 18 in the 11.2.17. It really talks about this, and it does talk about stabilized descent, and it says you should not descend below the MDA prior to reaching the VDP. It's not a shall, so I mean, it's there could be some circumstances out there where you would need to descend before your VDP, but it should be pretty far and few in between. And like you talked about too, you could also descend after your VDP, but a lot of times if you see even our local approaches, if you go past your VDP up to your missed approach point, really, I mean, a lot of these missed approach points are at the runway threshold. So obviously you're not going to be able to land out of the missed approach point when you're 400 feet above the runway threshold. So really, the farther you go past your VDP, the more pilotage you have to do to make that approach work, and realistically, the more unstable you're going to be, which is what we're trying not to accomplish here. In addition, the 217 does talk about unless familiar with the airfield, if possible, if visibility is limited, consider remaining at the MDA even if the runway environment is in sight, if terrain and obstacles along the final approach cannot be discerned. So what that's saying is that you really have to be cognizant of what's below you, and we'll talk a little bit later in the CT about this. But once you descend out of your MDA, obstacle clearance is on you. It's on the pilot, and if you're in an unfamiliar terrain, could be, low light conditions, or, the light's low on the horizon. You got fog obscuring stuff. Your best bet may be to not even descend out of your MDA, even if you're at your VDP and you have what you think the runway environment in sight. There could be other obstacles in between you and the runway that you just don't have the visibility or the wherewithal to make that safe descent. And it does talk about also that pilots should calculate a VDP if one is not published. So I know this question got brought up last week. So the 217 still says to calculate VDP if one is not published. It's a should there, but the common practice, it does make for, as we talked about, a more stabilized approach. So that's the best method to accomplish that. All right, let's get into kind of calculating the VDP and the common methods we have out there. So the VDP is based off of the lowest MDA published on the initial approach plate or instrument approach plate, and it's harmonized with the angle of the visual glide slope indicator, the VGSI. So in this example we have here out of Reno, you'll see there's multiple step down or multiple localizer mins, depending on this one has to do with the missed approach climb gradients. But as you can see, there we do have a published VDP at 4.7 DME. But that it's based off of the threshold crossing height or the TCH of, let's see, actually no, 5420 for MDA. So if we look at, maybe we can't meet the mins for the lowest mins, and we have to step down. So then we look at that second line down, which is 5720. That's a height above a threshold there of 1305. So we want to look at how do we calculate a VDP for the higher set of mins there. And so as from pilot training, which I'm sure most of you remember, there's the mnemonic Gus wears a hat. So what exactly is that? Well, glide slope angle. Basically, you're taking your height above touchdown divided by the glide slope angle. And with that, it basically gives you a VDP and nautical miles from the approach into the threshold there. So in this example, we have the height above or height above threshold 1305 divided by 310, so that 3.1 descent angle times that by 100, which is where we get our 310. And now that we get 4.2 nautical miles. And then just some basic math there, we're able to determine that that's the VDP is 6.1 DME from the runway threshold. Now this method, it's the most common one that I see out there. It's fairly accurate, but it's not the most accurate one. So if you do this similar calculation with the published, like compare this method against what the published VDP is, if you use the 1005 height above touchdown, you'll actually see you're like a couple tenths of a nautical mile off. And that's due to the fact that this method makes some rounding assumptions. As we'll see in this next slide, there is a little bit more accurate method to do it, but it does require a little bit more work to go into it. And so for this method too, what we're taking is the height above touchdown, and you're subtracting the threshold crossing height from it. So this is now you're putting yourself in a point where you're actually 50 feet or whatever the crossing height is above the runway. You're trying to do more precise calculation to put yourself over that define the threshold crossing height. And then instead of using the flight path angle, you're actually using the descent rate in feet per nautical mile. So for rounding, we typically say a 3-degree glide slope is 300 feet per nautical mile. In reality, it's closer to 318. If you look at this climb descent table on the right side here, the right column, the angle. So if you look at the 3.01 number, if you go left to the track that line all the way to the left side, to the left column there, the feet per nautical mile shows 320 feet per nautical mile. So that's where that 18 to 20 feet difference is makes a pretty big difference in the depending on how long or how far your VDP is, how much altitude you have to lose. So this using this chart takes out some of those rounding errors and gives you a little bit better, more precise VDP. So like I said, you take your height above touchdown minus your threshold crossing height and divide that by your descent rate in feet per nautical miles. So in this example, our flight path angle is 3.1 degrees. So if we look at the chart, the closest we have is 3.11, and we track that across, that gives us 330 feet per nautical mile. So if we plug that in to the equation, that gets us 3.8 nautical miles from the runway threshold, which then equals a VDP of 5.7 DME. So the difference in that, if you go back to the previous slide here, 6.1 DME versus 5.7. So you're looking at close to a half-mile difference there. And I'm not saying that's going to make or break your approach, but it does give it a little bit more fine-tuned VDP if you follow it precisely. Now, what are some of the tools we can use to actually, fly this VDP at the proper glide slope and all that? One of the biggest tools you have here is your rated descent table. If you look at the middle columns there, it gives you your ground speed. So if you say your approach speed is 120 knots, well, you go find your whatever your ground speed happens to correlate to that. Let's just say it's 120 knots. Then you track down to the horizontal line that you just calculated at your angle from. So we track down 120 down here, and we get 660 feet. So basically, that is our VSI that we want to set. So that's one tool we can help once we initiate our VDP to establish us on the appropriate glide path. And the second tool that we have inside the jet that works really well too is our angle. So we can set our flight path marker for the glide path we're looking for, which is 3.1, and then basically put the pig in the dance floor. Sorry, Nick, I know you hate that term, but you can put your flight path marker down and just follow that glide path down, and that should give you a pretty good glide path. Now, with all this been said, does anybody have any questions out of this?
Couple of questions in the chat if you want to take a look.
Yeah, so I see. Let's see. So one of the questions is talking about how do you actually get your VDP in DME once you calculate it. So if you look at the profile view of your approach plate, so you have all these distance markers down here on the bottom. And so what I try to do is correlate that to a DME. So here I know this is at WMCA, that's 2.5 DME. Well, WMCA is 0.6 miles away from the runway. So if I just subtract 0.6 from 2.5, that gives me 1 point at the runway threshold. It's 1.9 DME, and then from there I can take that 1.9 and then add the 3.8 nautical miles that I got from the VDP calculation, which is how I derive the DME 5.7 for my VDP. Does anybody else have any questions before I proceed? Cool. All right, so that's the quick and down and dirty for VDPs. From this, I'll go on to the next section here, talk about VDAs, which is your vertical descent angle. All right, from your vertical descent angles, these are published to the maximum extent possible on non-precision approaches, except those published in conjunction with vertically guided minimums. So basically, the FAA is trying to give this tool to you to help, essentially, it's almost like a constant descent, right? They're trying to give you a planning tool that helps stabilize your approach. And so on the profile view of your approach plates, if they publish a VDA, you'll see it on here. And so in this case, here at Travis, off of the ILS or ILS localizer, they haven't published a VDA, but in reality, what they're publishing for this particular approach is the glide slope for the ILS. And so when they publish these, there's two things they include with it. One is the angle, and then the second thing is the threshold crossing height. How the threshold crossing height comes into play in this is when the terpsters look at building the approach, they'll look at see what obstacles are out there and what flight path angle is the best that they can determine for the given scenario for the environment, etc. And then they'll build that angle from an altitude above the threshold. So in this case, the glide slope of 2.8 was built from a threshold crossing height of 54 feet. Now we'll see in the next slide that it varies based off of for a non-precision only approach plate. But other things you'll notice on this slide, at the top we have the VGSI and ILS glide path not coincident. Well, the reason that is because the glide slope, this VDA is built off of the ILS. If there was no precision approach to this runway, then what you would see is the VDA would be built off of the VGSI, so then inherently they would be coincident. One way to check kind of what the differences is on this, if it's not published on the approach plate itself, at least in the CONUS, if you go on arrow to the right to the tab next to the giant report, it'll say chart supplement. If you open that up, that's what you see on the bottom of the screen here. This is some additional information that you won't see in the IFR sub. This is actually in the chart supplement for, there's different regions around the US that have all these airfields, but if you look in here for runway 21 left, it'll actually tell you what your PAPIs are reading. So your angle is a 2.8, but your threshold crossing height is 75 feet, which is higher than the ILS glide slope crossing height 54 feet. Some of the differences on here is your PAPIs, the threshold crossing height is actually based off of where the pilot eyes are basically over the threshold, because obviously if you're seeing 2 red, 2 white, it's where from the pilot's perspective it's kind of where the altitude is based off. So your landing gear obviously is significantly lower than that. Now for your ILS, that threshold crossing height is based off of your ILS receiver, glide path receiver antenna on the aircraft, which is located on the bottom side of the nose or the visor. So this, like I said, this is an example of a VDA that's published with a associated precision approach. Now here's one you'll see for a non-precision. There's a couple of things to look at in here, but the first thing you'll notice is if you look at the VDA that's published, since there's no precision path associated with it, you don't see that GS next to the angle like you did with the ILS approach. And then you also see that there are PAPIs for this runway. So this 2.96 degrees is based off of what the PAPIs are providing you to cross the runway threshold at 52 feet. Now this approach came out of the PowerPoint that Loftus sent out last week, talking about the constant descent rate. One of the interesting notes that I found on this is the location of where this VDA is published on the approach plate itself, you'll see that it's after the step down fix of 760 feet. And this isn't by accident, it's intentional. What that's indicating to you is that this 2.96 descent angle is only valid after the step down fix. So if you flew a 2.96 at immediately after you pass the vortac, that would not clear your step down fix. In fact, if you flew a constant descent rate from the vortac all the way to the threshold, it'd be close to 2 degrees, which would obviously put you pretty well below your that step down fix there. And so something that if you were to fly this as a constant descent rate, there's the FAA talks about this approach in particular, and they said there's 2 acceptable methods to do this, fly this approach. If you're flying a constant descent rate, one of them is after you cross your final approach fix, you can initiate a shallow descent. Obviously, it won't be the full, almost 3 degree descent angle, but it'd be a shallower descent closer to 2 degrees. And then once you pass your step down fix, then you can increase your descent. The second acceptable method they have is that instead of descending after your final approach fix, is actually to remain level, hold your altitude until you reach a constant, until you basically reach a VDP, for better use of word, reach a point where you can then initiate a constant descent all the way to the runway threshold. In this case, if you do the calculations, you could drive in almost 2 miles from the vortac before you, or the FAF, before you initiate a 2.96 degree descent. And the thing of note on this one, the threshold crossing height, the TCH used to compute the descent angle, is published with the VDA, which I had previously talked about. And kind of the last point I want to talk about is visual segment obstacles. So as initially talked about, you can calculate your own VDP, but if there isn't a VDP published, there's probably a good reason there isn't one published. And this kind of brings it home to you. If you look in the profile view, you'll see it here, it says visual segment obstacles. And you also see there is no VDI published, as well as no VDP. And then what this is telling you is that the interpreters, they looked at this approach, they looked at all the obstacles in the visual segment area, and they determined that there's an obstacle out there that would preclude them from safely publishing an angle or a VDP to fly on this particular approach. And so, as I said before, once you depart your MDA, obstacle clearance is completely on the pilots to remain clear of. And so for this particular example, not only do they have visual segment obstacles published to kind of give you that warning that there's something out there, above it in the top of the approach plate, it says procedure NA at night. And so it's saying there's something significant enough out there that you have to visually acquire the obstacle in order to safely land. Another category that you might see is this approach plate off the right at Elmendorf. It says when your VGSI is in op procedure not authorized at night. So this one actually gives you a VDA, a published VDA, which you can use, but they've determined that the obstacle is serious enough that at night, if you don't see it, because you won't be able to see it at night, you have to have proper vertical guidance to actually descend. So hence the why the VGSI is required when at night. All right, that's the quick down and dirty I have for VDPs. what questions do you guys have out there? What do you guys want to reattack? And for those curious, or the math nerds out here, here's some trigonometry. Kind of shows how it was derived for VDAs or VDPs.
This is still off though, because the nautical mile is 6,076 feet. But meh.
Yeah, it came from, I think, AFSA, so you can blame them.
Hey, Dave, if you go back to the Elmendorf slide real fast,
Boom.
I just think it's kind of interesting that it talks about there's an obstacle. It says it's terrain. It's 1,900 feet from the threshold, 1,916 feet right of course, and 341 feet MSL. And then if you look at the actual chart, there's an obstacle charted for 263 feet right next to the center line. But then the obstacle that it's actually talking about, not charted anywhere. So I don't really know why Terpsters do some of the things that they do. If I had to throw a guess out there, that obstacle is like outside of a certain criteria, whereas the obstacle that's like kind of there by the river isn't within the criteria. I don't know. But anyway, it's just interesting that, they can literally talk about an obstacle and then chart an obstacle that I would argue is probably less significant because it's lower, but I don't know. It's very confusing.
Yeah, and do you happen to know offhand the depicted obstacles on the approach plate? Do they show spot elevations? Because I know, like in this particular example, though, there is essentially a ridge crossing that you have to cross over on this approach. So that 263 is actually, I believe, a tower that's before the ridge. It's probably below the ridge itself. So like I said, I don't know why they're depicting this the way they are, but I'm pretty sure that it's the terrain there is just a ridge. That's really the driving factor for why the VGSI is required.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And Jeff Gonch, to answer your question you just put up, it depends on the SIM database. So I would think Elmendorf is one of the fields that they have like good visuals for. I can't remember what the terminology they use is, but you should have it. Yeah, Jeff Lacey modeled. Thanks. But yeah, I'm almost positive Elmendorf good. And so if it's modeled appropriately, then yes, it should pretty much be like an exact match. Whether or not you can see it though, that's another question.
Tyler asked about timing. So I do have the rest of the I do have rest of this chart here. The bottom section of it actually goes into the timing considerations on it. But realistically, I mean, if you don't have DME, I mean, you could do DME substitution. And Tyler, I'll send out I'll include that timing part of the slide when I send out rest of these slides to the group. Well, what else do you guys have? Any reattacks for this, or anything else you'd like to discuss?
Hey, this is Lacey. I would just pile on with the importance of being able to do this math and like use those charts really quickly. If anyone's flown the TACAN 2.8 at Rota, that if you look at that approach plate, it doesn't have a VDP or a glide path angle or anything published. So you got to be able to do all that math on the fly and figure it out for yourself. And I think it's a 3.1 degree glide path with a 0.96 VDP. If anyone wants to check me on that.
Yeah, so that brings a good point. Really, it's actually not too bad calculating all of that if it's not depicted at all. Because one of the things you can do is just really using a combination of this method too that I have. You just take whatever your final pitch. If you want to do a constant rate descent, you could do, or you could just do it from your MDA. So take your threshold crossing height minus, so basically your altitude to lose divided by the distance. So you would take your well, I guess it's really your height above touchdown, and then divide that by the distance. So if you wanted, like Rota's example, you just take whatever the distance from the FAF to the runway is, and then divide that into the height that you have to lose from the final approach fixed altitude, and that would give you, what that number gives you is in this column here, your descent rate feet per nautical mile. So that once you have that number, then you can divide that into your height above touchdown. Nice stamps with your FAPE knowledge bomb.
So Paul, are you saying, so 10% of 1305, so 130, subtract that from going down the 120 column, and 3, so subtract 120 from 660? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, what are you looking at?
Can you use this example to explain your trick?
Yeah, so take I can't see the timing block on Dave's. What field are you guys at?
Okay, I'm checking now.
Say again. Yeah, you go to the timing block. You take 10% of your hat in seconds. So on the slide here, that's 1305, so 130. And then whatever the timing block says. What does it say?
For this approach. You can find it. You can do Travis here.
All right, so just go to Travis, ILS 2 and left. You guys there? Travis, ILS, localizer 2 and left. So we're flying the localizer. So if DME goes out, you go to the height above touchdown. You guys still hear me or no?
Yeah, we got you.
All right, height above touchdown is 442, so that's 44 seconds. And then you go to the timing block. You can use 120 if you're close to 120, or you can use 150 if you're flying close to 150. So basically, say we're flying 150, whatever, we'll say we're flying 140. I'd go to the 150 block. I'd say flying a little slower. It's going to be about 1:50. Then I would take my 44 seconds off of that. So what, 1:05. Hack the clock at the FAF, fly for 1:05, and then you're at your view.
Or use DME or use
Wizard.
RNAV substitution.
Does anyone want the clock? Like, real question.
Yeah, I'm just saying if you don't have any of that shit, you actually have to run
Yeah.
navigate. But
So here's a question for the group. For the Pappies. Have you guys seen any numbers published for like the different categories of Pappies, or like where the C5 falls into that? Like how high is our landing gear over the runway for the different categories, etc.
I was actually going to post that link to the Slack Pilot CT because the FAA has an advisory circular out on what's called Airplane Design Group. And so larger airplanes with bigger fuselages or higher wingspans are they're gonna cite the VASIs or the PAPIs different based on how big your airplane is. So that could maybe be a CT in and of itself.
Yeah, when I was doing my research yesterday, when you dig into it, there's definitely enough that you could really do a CT by itself.
What group category are we, or what's your best guess?
Either a 3 or 4.
Where I was thinking, I would just say like conservatively, we're maybe a 4 because we're pretty darn big.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident we're a 4.
Yeah, but even with that knowledge, though, it's hard to find where that info is even if you know what category you are, it's like you go to some random airfield. How do you know what that airfield or what those Pappies were designed to?
Yeah, that was
I know
something that when I started digging into it, I was trying to figure it out. It's not well published, and even the airfield managers don't really know. The best I've heard is that whatever is the most frequent airplane to that runway. So if it's like mostly 737 traffic, then that's what the Pappies have been cited to. But again, it's like kind of trivia hearsay, really hard to find the facts.
Agreed. I know CONUS, like I talked about, if you go to that chart supplement, that'll actually tell you what the crossing heights are, etc. So I think that's helps out quite a bit. And random fact, but if you look at Pappies, they're not always on the same spot on the runway. So typically they're on the left side of the runway, but they're not at the 1,000 board. Or they can be at the 1,000 board, but they vary in distance down the side of the runway, and that kind of based off of whatever glide path angle they're using, as well as what crossing height they're trying to achieve. So I'll say this: if you see Pappies at 1,000-foot marker, I can almost guarantee you they're not designed for a Category 4 aircraft. If you look at like Travis, they're closer to the 1,500-foot markers. Cool. Does anybody have anything else they want to talk about? Give you 5 seconds.
I'll just say I think this is something that we probably have let slip a little bit in our training and in the way that we fly sometimes. Stabilized approach criteria, I find that we try and brief to the criteria to make it easy instead of briefing what we're actually expecting to do. Some interesting examples, right? If you're circling, right, you're going to brief, you kind of need to brief like 2 criterias, right? Because if I'm circling at 155 knots or 160 knots, my initial descent rate from the final approach fix down to my circling MDA is going to need to be significantly higher than my standard 600 to 700 VBI. Whereas if I'm flying a, and then obviously as I make my turn to final and I'm fully configured, things like that, and it's maybe a different thing. So, the whole point of stabilized approach criteria is not to be able to develop a brief where you can have numbers that magically fit within the criteria. It's to actually say this is what I'm expecting to do, and then as you fly the approach, you recognize, hey, I'm not doing what I briefed that I was going to be doing. So I can use that as kind of a light bulb to say something's wrong, something's not. I didn't descend when I wanted to. I'm out of position. My speed's too fast, something like that. It's just one more essay builder. So something to think about as you brief your stabilized criteria. That should kind of be the time to think about this and be like, oh yeah, what is my FPA? Oh man, there's not a VDP there. Let me calculate that. I think it's something that we could do a little bit better at just as a community as a whole.
Cool. Thanks, Joel. All right. Any parting rounds, save rounds? Cool. Thanks, guys, for listening today, and put a plug out for future CTs. If you guys have an idea of something you want to discuss or talk about, please let your local training shop know. Joel, would be much appreciated. So thanks again, guys, and we got training priorities meeting here in about 15 minutes, so we'll get going to that. Thanks, guys.